Hello, this is Wes at Bad Seed Games, and we're going to be picking up where we left off in our camera tutorial. Now, previously we had set up the teleporter system, and today we're going to be setting up the event system to handle things such as boss battles. Now, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to make a duplicate of the point light and the floor, and move them over, so that we have a new space to work with. Let's take the teleporter and move it over here as well, so the player can get to it. Alright, so first thing we need is a new trigger point, so let's create a box, or a cube. And place it appropriately. Alright, let's scale it to the right size. Now, it doesn't have to be perfect, so don't worry about that. And let's give it a different color. Alright. So now this is usable as a trigger point right now because even the smallest fraction of the bounding box is enough to trigger the events. But if you need to adjust it, and I want to, let's make it a much bigger than that. Not that big. Oh boy. There. That ought to do it. Alright, so let's name it and make sure that it is a trigger. And of course, tag it appropriately. Alright. Now when it comes down to it, the way that we're going to have this set up is that the camera will stay moving. The camera will move and still follow the player, but we want the orientation to change. So instead of moving the camera, we're going to affect the main camera, which is a child of that object. Now, as you can see here, it still has a look at, but let's go ahead and create a new state, add a global transition, and this one's going to be boss fight. And let's add one more. This one's going to be a default, so that we have a way of getting back to the default camera. Let's give it a finish statement, feed it to idle. Alright, now this is going to be really simple. All we're going to be using is a smooth look at. And the difference between a smooth look at and a look at is a look at will just orient it on the first frame that it executes. The smooth look at will find a nice smooth transition and eventually move towards it. Now, we're not going to be having it look at an object this time. We're going to make it look at a variable. So let's declare a variable. So fight view point. Make sure it's a vector 3. And let's feed it into the target position. So let's clear the none, just so that it's nice and clean. And one thing you have to uncheck is the keep vertical. That usually gets on default, but the keep vertical will basically stop it from tilting up and down, and we want it to be able to tilt up and down in this. So now that we've got that, it's a good speed for now. So let's copy this, and let's paste it in the default. But what we're going to be doing is, instead of targeting the fight viewpoint, we're going to be looking back at the player. Now for this one though, we do need a finish distance because this is going to just be a transition from that camera angle back into the idle. Now if we place the default right here, as soon as it executes, it's going to snap right back because the look at will snap on the first frame. But we want a nice smooth transition, but we want it to be much faster. So let's give it 20. That seems fast. Now the finish tolerance, it depends on how fast you've got it set, but if we want it to have a nice smooth transition to where it should be pointing, the lower the number is, the better. But you don't want it to be 0, because if it's 0, it will never exit this action. It'll just say, hey, I'm not done yet. So instead of 1, let's put in 0.1. That should be a small enough window. Alright, so now that we've got the action set up in the camera itself, Let's go to the boss fight and set up this system. Right, now this one's pretty easy as we've all set it up before. It's a start state with idle and a trigger event. This is going to be using the system events, trigger enter, colliding with the player, send event, trigger enter, and we're going to want to store the player information. Make sure this is a game object. Let's add a new state that we want to go to. Let's call this one camera event. Since in this one we're going to be sending the telling the main camera to switch over to the new system that we just set up. And as before, using a send event, we're going to send it to a specific object. And let's send it directly to the main camera itself. Not the camera matrix, just the main camera. And it will be boss fight. When it's done, go to the next state. Let's call this one calculate. Since this is going to be a fairly math heavy. But we want to make sure that when the player exits, it will be able to transition back to its default state. So, trigger exit, wire it back. Let's copy the trigger event, paste it, and change it to exit. And we can drop the variable from this one. Since we don't need to store any information, we're just looking for a regular trigger event. Alright, so now let's get to it. In this, we're going to need to work with two variables, since the way that I have it set up is I want it to point to a midway point between the object and that you want to focus on and the player. Now, before we get too far, we need an object to focus on, so I'm just going to drag in this big enemy that I created a while ago. It's just a bunch of boxes with a few basic scripts, which aren't important at this point. Alright, so now that we have that, let's go into the variables. So first off, they're going to be game objects. We're going to have to add in the boss to fight. And since this is going to be hard-coded in, let's do it that way. Now, you can expose it to the inspector if you want to change it, for example, on the fly, like in your own game or anything else like that. But with the boss to fight and the player, we're going to be working with the vectors. So, boss vector. Let's make sure it's a vector3 variable. And player vector. Because what we're going to do is we are going to get the average point between these two vectors. So let's make one more. Average vector. So now that we've got that, let's get the position information from those variables that we've declared. So get position. Let's add two of them. First one is going to be the boss to fight. Second one is going to be the player. Let's store it in boss vector and player vector respectively. Okay. Now, if you remember your math class, the process in order to get an averaged value is to add both of them together and then divide them by 2, or divide them by however numbers that you've added up. Since we're only working with 2, we only need to divide by 2. So first step is we need to add the two vectors together. Now, you could go ahead and add each axis separately and then collate them together into a vector3 variable later, but Playmaker does have the option of working with vector3s in such a way. And to do that, we're going to be using the vector3 operator. You can find this in the vector3 subsection. So let's feed it the values we want. So boss vector and player vector. Now it's default set to add, but you can also do quite a few options in here. I'm going to admit I'm not sure what absolutely every single one of these is, mainly because this is a learning experience for me as well. But let's store the result in average vector. Alright, so we've added the two vectors together. The next step that we have to do is we need to divide them by half. So let's see if we can find a vector 3 divide, if there is one. And it doesn't look like there is. But we can multiply it, since if you remember math, if you wanted to divide something by 2, you can multiply it by 1/2. So let's take the average vector and multiply it by 0.5. And now that we have this, all we have to do is we have to feed that information into our camera, into the fight viewpoint. So let's get the set vector 3, the set FSM vector 3. Let's add that in. We're going to send it to a specific object, which is the main camera. It will be an orientation and the fight viewpoint, and we will feed it averaged vector. Okay, so now that we've gotten all this math done, what do we do? Well, there are two ways that we can do it. Since this is going to be updated real time, we need this information to be calculated every frame. Now there are a couple ways you can do that. Now we can go through and check each action as every frame, because they are available in these ones. However, there are some actions that you will eventually come across in your own game development that won't have the option of executing every frame. And if you need to calculate, or if you need to use them on an every frame basis, there is a workaround, and I'm going to show you how to do that. First off, let's create an event. Let's call it cycle. Let's add it. And let's wire it back. Now, in order to wire it back, you're going to have to click on the event that you want to wire back and drag it outside of the finite state machine first before you loop back in onto the state that you want. If you just drag right up, it won't recognize that you're actually trying to make a wiring. It won't recognize you're trying to wire it up. So that's why you have to drag it out first and then back in. Now, what we're going to use this with is a next frame event. The very bottom, and it's going to call cycle. Okay. So now that we've got this mechanism set up, let's just double check by exposing the variables to the inspector so we can watch them as they go. Average, boss, and player. Let's hide this one for now. Now keep your eyes on here. So we're going to use this as a test just to make sure that the math that we want it to do is being done. So let's give it a shot, play the game, and as you can see, since the boss isn't moving, its vector is not updating. But as we are moving, the player is. And the average, the boss is 82, you are at 65, so 73 in the X, minus 3. Yeah, it looks like it's averaging all three values properly. Alright. Now there is one more thing that we need to do. In between the calculations and the idle, we haven't told the camera to go back to its default position, so let's address that. Easy way of doing that, copy this action, paste action before, and let's change it from boss fight to default. Alright, so let's give it a test just to make sure that it is transitioning properly. We're in. It's transitioning. It looks like it's moving between the two and back. Now that does seem a little bit fast, so let's adjust that. So that would be the default back. So 20 is too fast. Let's try 10. Now at this point in time, this is more of an issue of preferences. If you want to have a quick snap back, you can. It's up to you. Okay. Now the next step in this is to take a look and see what's happening with the camera trigger. Now just for ease of use, I'm going to move the player over here. And just watch this space. Because since we haven't told it to ignore the boss fight since we're treating it in a different way, it thinks that it's a regular ordinary camera, and the camera is still, it's moving. So we need to set up a system to tell it to ignore the command on this one. That one's pretty simple. First off, we're going to have to set up a Boolean value in each of these. So I'm going to go ahead and add them. Let's call it inFight. And what this is going to do is it's just going to store a simple bit of information as to whether or not this is a fight or it is not a fight. In this one, it is. Let's copy that so there is no risk of typos. And in this, it is going to be false, and same here. Okay, so now that we have the Boolean values that we're going to be extracting, next thing we do, let's add a new state. Since if there is a target, it's going to go into the target available. So let's do this and call this one getBool. Let's use the get FSM bool game object, a specific game object. Now we're going to be using the trigger variable, but again, since the trigger variable is currently empty, let's drag an item in here, set it up. Oh, and it looks like there's one thing I forgot to do. Ha! Alright, looks like I forgot to name the finite state machine, so let's do that right now. There, okay. Trigger system, inFight. Let's store it in a bool here, so inFight. Alright, now that that's done, let's add a finished. Let's add one more state. This is going to be a bool test. So, fight bool. It's going to use two events. Now, let's use the null and is not, the is null and not null. And let's use a simple Boolean test. In the logic subsection, we're testing inFight, inFight, and if it is true, we want it to be not null, since a null value would be false. So if true, not null, and is null for false. So is null, we're just going to go to the no target. For the not null, let's just go to the in trigger, since we don't want to send an event to the actual camera to change its movement. There is one more thing we need to do, however, and that the variable that we've got, the inFight, it is going to store the value of what it was in last. So if, for example, if we're going through a game and we may have forgotten to add a Boolean value, it's going to say, hey, that's okay, I've already got this one stored. So let's go Boolean, the set bool value, and let's add that to idle. What we're going to do, put it at the top, take the inFight, and make sure that it is set to false. Therefore, it will always be false unless we are encountering a fight object, and in which case it will then go through these calculations. Alright, now one more thing. Again, we need to make sure to set that back to the trigger that we're colliding with. Alright, so let's give it a test. Alright. This trigger point still works. And teleport. And enter. Alright, so it looks like the system that we have is set up the way that I'm hoping to have it work. But there is one thing that I've kind of noticed. Since we're working with the pivot points of each object. Sometimes you may, in a particular case, for example, if you're using a regular box that's large and its pivot point is a little bit higher, that's going to affect the actual position of the camera. So I'm just going to add in one small little tweak. So we're going to take the vector 3 operator and the vector 3 multiply, and I'm going to copy them and paste them, because we're going to do this one more time. We're going to add the player vector with the averaged vector. So in essence, it's going to say if this teleporter is the player. Actually, let's move the player over so it's a lot easier. Alright. So say you have the player and the object. Currently, the average would be around here. But I kind of want the average to be around here, about a quarter of the way. And that's easily done. Now, if you wanted to make it a quarter of the way closer, instead of a quarter of the way to the player, all you have to do is, instead of that player vector, use the boss vector, like that. But I'm going to use the player vector, and let's average that. Let's see how that goes. Again, this does boil down to a little bit of a personal preference, but this is an option that you can do if you wish. Alright, so let's give it a test. We've entered, and it's more focused on the player. Now let's pause it. So I'll show you what I mean with the previous. So instead of the player vector, let's choose the boss vector. And resume. As you can see, it's shifting more towards the actual boss. But again, this is something that you can add in if it's to your preferences. But other than that, this particular system has been completed. Now, all that you have to do is, if you want to add, like for example, turn off the mesh renderers, or add in any extra frills or bells and whistles like particle systems, it's totally up to you. But other than that, I hope this tutorial has shown you a few things. And if you like this video, feel free to comment and rate it however you wish. And if you feel so inclined, subscribing would be awesome. Other than that, have a great one, and I'll catch you later.